Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to episode 11 of NCERT International Relations. Today we are going to talk about the tremendous rise of the Chinese economy, how China reformed itself in the 1970s and 80s. How did it manage to emerge as a global manufacturing powerhouse? And how China has leveraged its economic strength to exercise dominance in global geopolitics. It's a fascinating story because a communist China, which was extremely poor, backward in 1950s and 60s, which was struggling with a number of internal challenges, it managed to do the unthinkable within a few decades. And today it's well on its way to even overtake the United States in another few years as the world's largest economy in terms of its GDP size. Believe it or not, from 1978, China has seen very good growth numbers, averaging at almost 8 to 9%. It has managed to lift 800 million people out of poverty. And this is not less than any miracle. So, as part of the ongoing NCRT series for international relations, today in class 11, we will talk about this fascinating story of China, the rise of China, how its economy has evolved over the decades. We will talk about the policies, the reforms, and we will also understand this from India's perspective. What does it mean for India to deal with such a massive economy as our neighbor, which has standing disputes with India? In our previous sessions, we have spoken about India China border dispute. We have covered the 1962 war and the current geopolitical challenges we face from China. So, looking at its economic rise and its current role in global economy and global geopolitics will further help you understand this argument more precisely. So, in today's session, I'm going to divide my discussion into different phases, starting right from China's establishment following the Chinese Civil War with the emergence of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, how a planned economic model was followed, inspired by the ideals of socialism, guided by the Soviet Union, aided by the Soviet Union, how many problems and challenges came up in the Chinese economy and society in 1950s and 60s, the disastrous mistakes of Chinese leaders like Mao Zedong in 1960s and 70s, and finally how China opened up to the world, how it abandoned its ideological commitment to socialism and adopted a unique form of capitalism, a Chinese version of capitalism from the 1970s to 1990s, which essentially allowed the PRC to emerge as one of the fastest growing economies. And today, it's in a position to exercise its dominance across the world. Not just economic dominance, but even military, diplomatic, and strategic dominance. That's why I said it's a very fascinating story as to how China has managed to do this. This journey of China holds key lessons for India. China has made plenty of mistakes, and that could be a key lesson for a rising power like India as well. And that is what we'll try to break down in today's session. So, before we proceed, I would like to inform you that Unacademy is now offering its subscription at just 16,999. If you're looking to enroll with us, study with us for your upcoming attempts, then this is the right opportunity. I'm told the offer will end tomorrow on August 27th. And if you enroll within the offer period, you will not only get the subscription at just 16,999, you will also get up to 12 months of free extension. So those interested, please check out the link provided in the description. And to avail the offer, you have to enter the code IAS English. And also, as part of the NCRT series, as you know, we are conducting weekly quiz every Thursday and Friday at 3 p.m. on the Unacademy app. We've already completed 4 sessions. Two more sessions are lined up for tomorrow and day after. On 27th, 28th of August, we will be bringing out the last two practice quiz sessions, which will help you revise these topics and attempt UPSC standard prelims questions. So don't forget to join me live tomorrow at 3 p.m. And you can access these classes by scanning the QR code on your screen. You will be taken to a web page where all the links of these 6 special classes are provided. So do ensure that you enroll for them. Because at the end of this course on 31st August, we will be conducting a mega quiz for NCERT International Relations with 50 MCQs. So you will essentially get an opportunity to attempt a UPSC standard paper with 50 questions from international relations and fine tune your preparation for IR along with your optional for PSIR as well, right? Because this will fine tune your concepts, your foundational knowledge. So this test will take place on 31st August from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. You just have to scan the QR code on your screen to enroll for the mega quiz. And the top performers will also get a 20% additional discount on Unacademy Platinum subscription. And if you want the PDF of these sessions, please scan this QR code on the screen. By tomorrow, I'll be sharing the PDF over here. Now let's come back to our discussion and let's talk about China in 1949. How was China's economy after the establishment of the PRC, the People's Republic of China? Now, if you want to know how the PRC was formed, then you need to know about the Chinese Civil War, which I've already discussed in one of my previous sessions. So I urge you to go back and watch that session if you haven't yet, so that you have a clear understanding of the emergence of the PRC, how it was established following the Chinese Civil War. Now, let's just talk about the economic developments. Let's just focus on the socio-economic conditions in the PRC. What economic model did China adopt? And what policy mistakes were made from 1940s to 1970s? See, China, as it was set up as a authoritarian communist state, it obviously adopted the socialist economic model, where the state was essentially in control of all the wealth and resources and all the manners of production. The Soviet model is what China was replicating. In fact, it took direct aid and assistance from the Soviet Union in 1950s to implement the socialist model of economy where the state controlled every manner of production in the economy. Meaning there were no market forces, no free market economy. Production was not based on demand. It was entirely state controlled, where the state would set production targets. It would create a quota system. It would essentially isolate the economy from the global world order and create tariff and non tariff barriers. That is exactly how a state controlled economy looks like, where foreign investments are not allowed. Private ownership, entrepreneurship is not allowed. The state is everything. The state will decide with regard to agriculture production. The state will decide with regard to industrial manufacturing, right? It will set targets which have to be met, which means local officials will have tremendous authority and power. And especially those who are entrusted with the task to conduct audits, inspections, they will have tremendous leeway, creating a system where corruption gets incentivized and it actually has an adverse impact on the economy itself. Because a blind target driven economy is never bound to succeed if you ignore the fundamental principle of free market economy, which is demand and supply, right? Supply has to be coterminous with and commensurate with the demand that is present, and it should be kept variable to be allowed to be determined by the free market forces. The moment state tries to control every manner of production, such states are bound to fail and collapse, and we have numerous examples of this. India itself suffered from this crisis eventually, though the socialist principles in our economy initially helped to create large, heavy industries and even to transform our agriculture and manufacturing in the initial decades. By 1980s and 90s, the license Raj, Inspector Raj era eventually brought down the Indian economy, and we had to deal with a massive crisis in 1991, which pushed India to open up and introduce the LPG reforms. So, China essentially controlled every aspect of its industrial development, agricultural growth. It implemented the Soviet model of collective farming, where individual households would not own the farm, the state would own the farm. The state would set production targets, and all the agricultural output was supposed to be essentially controlled by the state. Farmers could not freely sell it in the open market for higher profits. The prices would be distorted, the prices would be fixed by the state. So this destroys incentive, it destroys innovation, it destroys competition. So that is a system which will essentially create an inefficient economic model And that's the prime reason why the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. In the very first and second classes of the NCRT series, we have discussed one of the biggest weakness of the Soviet Union, which was its socialist model of economy, state-controlled economy. So China went through a similar experience in 1950s, 60s, and 70s period. It was already facing a very dire situation back in 1949 because of years of civil war and World War II. China's infrastructure had been destroyed. Remember, we spoke about the Japanese invasion. We had spoken about the civil war involving the nationalist Kuomintang Party of the Republic of China and the Communist Party of China under Mao Zedong. So, decades of internal war, strife, and external conflict had decimated the infrastructure and the economy of China. Local demand had collapsed. Rural agrarian economy had completely fallen apart. There was absolutely no base for industrial expansion. Though China was blessed with vast demography, it had sufficient labor force, it had a wide distribution of resources, natural resources. Still, China could not capitalize on them because of the decimating effect, right? The devastating effect of the world wars and the civil war that China had gone through. So it had a huge population which was not literate, which was not well educated. Healthcare was a big challenge. Socio-economic welfare had not been prioritized. So PRC was facing multiple problems, social, economic, and external challenges. So at this time, China turned towards its two biggest assets under Mao Zedong. One was the vast labor force given its massive population. Though the population was not well educated or skilled, the capital, the human capital itself, became China's primary resource in 1949 1950s. Then, the resources that China is blessed with. China has massive coal deposits, huge deposits of various minerals, with China giving priority for iron and steel industry. Then later the cement and fertilizer industry. Though China is largely deficient in hydrocarbons, it relies heavily on West Asian oil and gas with regard to its energy security. It had other resources that it could capitalize upon. Now, even today, when you look at China's mineral deposits, it even has rare earth deposits. It has access to key strategic minerals. And today, it has managed to dominate the entire supply chains by even accessing mines across the world, from Latin America to Africa to Australia. So back then in 1949, China turned to its two biggest assets, given the economic challenges it was facing with. In 1950s, it initiated the planned model of development, the five-year plans, which is a classic feature of a socialist economy. It turned towards its human capital, primarily the rural agrarian economy, to increase agrarian output, to increase rural demand, and thus drive industrialization. So China initially focused on heavy industries, large industries based on coal, electricity, cement, fertilizers, iron and steel. So this required labor force which China was able to collect from the rural areas. And it also looked towards a large urban migration to create new urban centers of growth. So from 1953 to 57, under Mao Zedong, a communist socialist China implemented its first ever five-year plan. Under the five-year plan, special focus was given to rapid infrastructure development, focusing on ports, focusing on road and railway connectivity, electricity and water supply, new urban centers, expanding the industrial clusters. This became a top priority. But given the Soviet model and the state controlled nature of the economy, where there was centralized planning, where the state controlled every aspect of the economy, and since there was no scope for private enterprise, private capital, state owned enterprises essentially got complete leeway to control all aspects of economic production. So, China initially focused on heavy industries with little focus on consumer goods, with little focus on how it would affect the common people. Instead of producing day-to-day essentials, China started mass producing iron, steel, coal, and other basic necessities that are required for large, heavy industries. But with regard to consumer economy, with regard to consumer goods, China started falling behind. And many of these state-owned enterprises, they were blindly trying to meet their targets, the state-given targets given by bureaucrats of the Communist Party, just to appease the higher leadership. So this tendency of pleasing the leadership, this tendency of blindly following the state given targets, it created its own set of problems, and China ended up paying a very, very big price because of the socialist principles that were strictly implemented under Mao Zedong. So we will talk about the big mistakes of Mao Zedong, the great leap forward, the cultural revolution, and how China came out of this dark period and how it completely turned itself around. But before we discuss these key points, I would like to introduce to you the advanced mains program of Unacademy. Since UPSC aspirants face a very big challenge in answer writing, we are launching a dedicated program to give you a hand-holding experience to improve your answer writing skills. Under the advanced mains program, the classes will start from 2nd September and will continue till the 10th of January with 240 plus hours of classes. In these classes, we will mainly focus on mains relevant subjects, mains relevant content, be it the concepts, be it the current affairs, with PYQ based, theme based discussion of questions and guidance in answer writing practice in each and every class. We will also take up probable question areas, give sufficient practice questions in each and every class, and help you write more and more answers. And this also includes weekly test with evaluation and a detailed feedback, a full length test at the end of the course, along with detailed notes being provided in each session. So this mains focused program, which is mainly prioritizing answer writing practice, is priced at 9,999, and you can even see the rough schedule over here spread across different subjects. So every day you will roughly have 2 hours classes where we will not only teach these basic topics, but we will mainly handhold your answer writing journey, right? Provide that customized and personalized support that is required for students, that guidance and mentorship that is required to ensure that you start writing better answers by the end of this course. So if you're interested, please check out the details of this program in the link provided in the description. Now, coming back to our discussion, why did Chinese economy essentially suffer in the 50s and 60s? The problem here lied with the Soviet socialist model, right? As I said, when state is controlling all the manners of production with no focus on the actual requirement of the economy, with no focus on demand, with no freedom for free market forces, it always results in inefficient allocation and utilization of existing resources. Now, let's say, for example, under a centralized planning model, steel industry is asked to produce a certain amount of steel. Now, the factories will meet the target probably in the first year. For second year, now the state will increase the target. Now they will blindly run behind the production numbers. They'll recruit more people. They'll push more investments. They'll procure more iron ore, and they will meet the target second year as well. But nobody is bothered in such a system whether that steel is actually being consumed. Is there a real demand for so much steel in the market? What will happen if excess steel is lying around? Because the state will blindly keep on giving fresh targets. The moment one target was met, the target would be increased. So, with no focus on demand, with no focus on what the people wanted, what the economy actually required, the blind target led production, centralized state controlled production, it's always a recipe for disaster. It is a very inefficient way of utilizing your resources. So, few industries which are being prioritized, they will create jobs, they will create employment, they will increase their production, but other areas will fall behind. For example, when agriculture was not privatized, when agriculture was pushed into a collective model, a state controlled model, farmers actually had no incentive to work hard to increase their agricultural output. They blindly had to try and meet some targets, right? They were not producing what the economy required because they would not get incentivized for their efforts. They would not reap the benefits. They would not see any difference in their standard of living, while the state would simply claim that the targets are being achieved. It would simply try to drive a nationalist approach, pushing people to achieve a patriotic goal while people were suffering, struggling on the ground, especially workers, farmers, peasants. In many ways, this has been the biggest irony of communism, right? While communist philosophy is entirely built on elevating the suffering of the masses, primarily farmers, peasants, and workers, it ended up oppressing the very same people, the main support base of the Communist Party, because of the failed and the flawed economic model. The weak incentive system simply drove productivity with actually no requirement for that output which was being produced. In fact, China dealt with a problem which is popularly known as the backyard steel campaign or the backyard steel, which means factories were producing so much steel that market never required that amount of steel and the steel was simply disposed in the backyard. Steel was lying around everywhere in every nook and corner in Chinese industrial centers with nobody willing to buy that steel because the economy did not require so much amount of steel. So imagine what would have happened in other sectors when a blind target led model was promoted, led by state owned enterprises. Plus, these enterprises lacked efficiency because they never focused on profitability. They became loss making enterprises. And in most cases, the state would bail them out. Now, don't you think this is a similar story that India went through? Though India's large public industries initially contributed to the industrial base of India in the 50s and 60s, later on, these very industries became a burden. Many of them became loss making entities as there was no competition, no desire for innovation, no incentives. And it essentially dragged the economy down. And since these industries were too large to fail, every time they suffered losses, the state would step in to bail them out, creating a highly inefficient model where capital was being diverted towards non productive purposes. Labor was being diverted towards non useful activities. So eventually, this model will collapse on its own. And the price distortion, when prices are fixed irrespective of demand and supply equation, you are essentially violating the very fundamental principle of a modern economy. And there is no desire, no incentive here for competition, for innovation, to come out with better products, to improve the design of a product, to improve customer experience. Nobody is bothered about it. Why? Because the state is simply running after targets and dragging the entire nation behind these blind targets, which may not be serving the actual purpose of the economy. So eventually, this Soviet model started becoming a drag on the Chinese economy. It started pulling China down. It did lay an industrial base. It did create some employment initially. But by 1960s, this model was falling on its own like a pack of cards. That's when Mao Zedong panicked. He was extremely worried about his political image. And he launched one of the most disastrous campaigns, the Great Leap Forward, from 1958 to 1962, where he made an attempt to further instill a stronger ideological commitment towards communism and socialism by forcefully pushing the Chinese people towards adopting greater communism and socialism. So the end result was the unrealistic targets for various industries basically led local officials to exaggerate their own achievements. They would deliberately, you know, overclaim the actual targets that they were meeting. They would essentially inflate the reports to impress their higher officials, their seniors, because that is how the incentive model was built. If someone had to rise up in the Communist Party, they had to impress the higher ranks, and they would falsely claim that all the given targets at the local level were being met. So, inflated reports, unrealistic targets simply led to a vicious cycle of more higher targets being given. Whether the economy required this or not, nobody cared about it, nobody bothered about it. All the precious resources from fertilizers to steel, cement, everything was underutilized, diverted towards non useful activities. And as a result, agriculture as a sector collapsed. Since heavy industries had become a priority, with blind targets being given, revised every year again and again, officials busy chasing these heavy industry targets, agriculture being a collective model with no incentive for private farmers, eventually collapsed on its own, triggering a massive famine that ended up killing tens of millions of people. By 1960s, China had suffered from a devastating, destructive famine. Shortage of food had triggered hunger, malnutrition, triggering millions and millions of deaths, which was a direct result of the disastrous and short-sighted policy of Mao Zedong, which highlighted the failures of the communist socialist model of economy, the state-controlled economy. So this disastrous famine had a lasting socio-economic impact. Today, China itself acknowledges that these policies were disastrous, that blind commitment to socialism and blind commitment to the ideology of communism would not solve the problems of the state and the people. So this realization it came much later. It was only in the late 70s that China started correcting its path. But under Mao Zedong, the great leap forward, the greater push towards socialism, communism, and chasing blind targets led to the collapse of agriculture and a catastrophic famine that led to the deaths of tens of millions of people. Then came a few partial corrections. The then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai proposed the four modernizations, but this plan was never implemented. Zhou Enlai wanted to prioritize agriculture, industry, science and technology, defense, and create an all round holistic model to revive the damage and revive the economy which had been stalled. But Mao Zedong's pursuit of communist ideology and pursuit of individual greatness, it led China towards a deeper pit. Though few attempts were made to reform, for example, China finally relaxed some of the state control over agricultural land and agricultural profits. It tried creating an incentive model for farmers. It allowed private ownership to some limited extent with regard to land and property. It did see a growth in real estate industry in urban centers. It did increase private ownership of farming land. There was a better incentive model that was seen in the mid 60s. Attempts were made to link industrial production with direct incentives and demand based economy, but none of them were properly implemented because of Mao Zedong's obsession with the communist socialist ideology. Though Zhou Enlai was pushing for four modernizations through a more market linked model, a demand driven model with greater support for incentives, Mao Zedong basically turned it around, and then he initiated the disastrous cultural revolution for which millions of Chinese paid the price again. Under the Cultural Revolution that started in 1966, lasted a decade until the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, Mao Zedong made an attempt to essentially work on the political ideology of communism, to target intellectuals, to target any critics, to target old traditions, and essentially bring down the very Chinese society on which it was built upon. He created the infamous Red Guards by mobilizing the Chinese youth, particularly in colleges, creating a paramilitary. The Red Guards was essentially a notorious paramilitary comprised of radicalized students who were radicalized on the ideology of left wing extremism, communism, socialism. This was essentially China's Revolution 2.0. Mao Zedong was hoping he could reunite the masses, rally political support behind him, if he could revive that revolutionary spirit. Right? That's how Mao Zedong had emerged as a leader of the Communist Party in the 1930s and 40s. So he made a second attempt to carry out such a similar revolution, but this time using students as his proxy to target old traditions, customs, to target intellectuals and critics and anyone posing an opposition to Mao Zedong's policies. This simply led to an internal crisis where the paramilitary would target um, anyone who's not aligned with the communist goals, who's not aligned with Mao's vision. Mao Zedong infamously held the so called Little Red Book, where he would give out these doctrines, which would be blindly followed and consumed by these radicalized students. This had a devastating impact. The society was purged. Chinese culture, tradition, customs were basically destroyed. And in particular, intellectuals and critics, they were essentially targeted. They were beaten. It led to violence. Many people were killed and slaughtered. Many of them were jailed. A lot of fabricated charges were brought up by mobilizing the youth, basically creating huge friction, a social friction within the country because of this cultural mobilization that Mao Zedong had pushed for. He believed that by reinstilling the faith of the people in communism and socialism, he could somehow create a second revolution of sorts. But this ended up being another disastrous experiment in communist China. After the disaster of Great Leap Forward, then Mao Zedong contributed to the Cultural Revolution for a decade where innocent people were purged in the society. People became extremely scared to even raise one suspicion, one doubt against the leadership, creating a total authoritarian regime backed by militias and paramilitary groups like the Red Guards, which were blindly aligned with the Communist Party and blindly committed to one leader, that is Mao Zedong. So it took China nearly 3 decades to find the right path. During these 3 decades, China had just seen poverty, suffering, poor education, lack of employment, lack of opportunities, poor healthcare. Its infrastructure, though it was made a priority in the first 5 year plan, never saw a massive improvement. Large industries, most of them became loss making entities as they were all state controlled. The huge capacity which had been created never met the actual requirement of the economy. And despite all the resource mobilization and the human capital mobilization, people suffered from famine, food shortage, and lack of basic necessities. So, this came as a learning experience for Communist China. So, with the death of Mao Zedong, a new opening came up in China. A new chapter was opened. And that credit for reforming China to what it is today largely goes to this leader, Deng Xiaoping. From 1978 onwards, Deng Xiaoping brought back the four modernization pillars of Zhou Enlai. What Zhou Enlai had proposed in 1964, which was never implemented because Mao Zedong had pushed the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, was now brought back by Deng Xiaoping and implemented very proactively from 1978 onwards. This is the era where China had already opened up to the United States. China had distanced itself from the Soviet Union. China had realized the limitations of blind commitment to socialism. Though China remains a communist power today, remains an authoritarian power even today, its commitment to socialism has largely declined. Today, China follows a mixed model. China follows capitalism with Chinese features. There are few socialist features which still remain, but there is no other country which has embraced capitalism like China. It has adopted Western capitalism, customized it to the Chinese context over the last 5 decades, and that has been the prime reason behind China's remarkable transformation. So, under the four modernization pillars, Deng Xiaoping prioritized agriculture, industry, science and tech, and defense. The focus was on creating private incentives for those who perform well. If farmers are producing more, let them earn more money by selling the produce in the market. Let the farmers own the land. Let there be private property ownership. Let there be private capital and investments. Let there be foreign investments. It was Deng Xiaoping who opened up Chinese economy from its global isolation. Until then, Mao Zedong had cut off China from the rest of the world. For the first time, China started embracing the global economy, started connecting with global supply chains. It focused on innovation. It focused on a demand driven economy, started introducing few market free market principles with limited state control. See, even today, state control is present in the Chinese economy, but it's very limited and restricted to some areas, some specific priorities. Whereas private entrepreneurship is encouraged, private ownership, private investments are encouraged, foreign investments are encouraged. So this transition, it basically took place under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. It led to higher income in the rural areas. Now that farmers were basically allowed to exercise full control over their land, over their produce, they were allowed to retain their profits by selling the higher produce in the market. See, there were state limits where farmers had to mandatorily sell a part of the produce to the state. They had to meet the state given targets. But anything beyond that, they could sell in the markets and earn a higher profit creating a incentive model for these farmers. So this overall agricultural reform, opening up of collective farming towards private farming, where state relaxed control over agricultural land, agricultural production targets, gave more autonomy to the local governments, and ensured that farmers would reap the benefits with right state support through fertilizers, water, electricity. This led to complete transformation of China's agriculture. So what happens because of the transformation in agriculture? It increased rural income. With increase in rural income, rural demand started going up. It contributed to urban settlements coming up. It contributed to widespread urbanization in 1980s and 1990s. It created demand for consumer goods, which could be met through large scale manufacturing. Because this demand that came from rural China, from agrarian China, was massive. This era saw a big migration of Chinese rural labor towards the urban market, where factories, industries were basically coming up to meet the rising industrial demand for consumer goods. And essentially, local industries were actively encouraged at the town level, at the village level, which was entirely missing previously. See, previously, China's obsession was heavy industries and state controlled agricultural output, which had been a flawed model. Now, on agricultural output, the controls were relaxed. China's state control over land was also relaxed, allowing farmers to reap the benefits of better production, increasing rural income, increasing rural demand. And parallelly, support was given for local industries at the local town level, city level, village level. These TVEs, town village establishments, enterprises started coming up with private capital and investments. And this started catering to the demand that was present. It started creating more jobs because there was a surplus of labor. China diverted this increased wealth towards improving education, healthcare, basic infrastructure. Massive investments went into port infrastructure, roads, railways, electricity, water supply. Large public projects were taken up, which basically turned the Chinese economy around, leading to massive industrialization and urbanization in the 1980s and 1990s. So, this is the journey that China went through. So, following the four modernization pillars that were pioneered by Deng Xiaoping, there was greater investments in research and development, innovation, on creating human capital, trained, skilled workforce, and establishing special economic zones, which were export oriented industry clusters, which would get state backed incentives, subsidies to basically mass produce at scale, take the advantage of cheap labor in the Chinese economy, and produce for the world. This is how China started emerging as the factory of the world, as the manufacturing hub of the world. According to the World Bank, the establishment of four major SEZs, special economic zones, in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen, these were the most radical, transformative approaches that the Chinese economy had undertaken. This was port led development, export led development, manufacturing led development. All of a sudden, the rural population, which was now migrating towards urban areas because they had a higher income, they wanted a better quality of life, they found jobs in these factories, industries. There was active state encouragement to promote these export oriented units with special tax rebates, subsidies, and incentives being given by the state. And whatever was produced, from a small needle to a hairpin to a computer to an electronic chip, everything was backed by the state and everything was mass produced at scale to bring down the overall cost of production. So it reached a point where nowhere in the world could you match the Chinese cost of production. The labor was already cheap, labor was available in excess. By then, education, skills, and literacy had improved, creating the right match between the labor force and the industrial demand. China had parallelly mobilized the resources from water to electricity to other basic essentials that are required, from cement to steel to fertilizers, which was driving all-round transition and shifting the Chinese economy from an agrarian-dominant economy towards a manufacturing-driven, export-led economy. So 1978 to 1990 is when this mega transition happened. This is a scale that humanity has never witnessed in history, where millions were now being uplifted. And by 1990s, China had essentially started moving upwards with one of the fastest growing economies in the world. From 1980s itself, China started registering 8-9% growth, emerging as the fastest growing economy within a matter of a decade. So it introduced a mixture of market mechanisms with state controlled mechanisms. So free market was encouraged to some extent. Private ownership was encouraged. Private investments were encouraged. Entrepreneurship was promoted. Foreign investments through FDI and institutional investments were promoted, basically setting up China as the factory of the entire world. This was the time when production in US, Europe had become too costly and expensive because of rising raw material cost and labor cost. These countries started outsourcing their manufacturing, creating a model where Western companies were now looking at cheaper centers of production. So Western giant multinational corporations, they started looking at China as an attractive manufacturing destination where they could outsource the production, making fresh investments, bringing technology and capital, and utilizing the advantages and opportunities being created by the Chinese state. But overall, the state remained in complete and totalitarian control of the economy, where the state would essentially control the forex reserves, control the foreign currency value, control the flow of foreign investments, heavily subsidize the industries, maintain a strict control over private entrepreneurs, never allowing one industry or one billionaire to become too large beyond a point, ensuring that state supremacy remains in place. So you get to see a mixture of market and state mechanisms. So that has led to the evolution of capitalism in China with Chinese characteristics. So, from a blindly socialist, communist aligned country, strongly committed to its ideological goals, China has now shifted towards actually Western market capitalism with unique Chinese characteristics where there is state control, but free market principles have been blended and mixed, which serves the Chinese communist state interests. So after Deng Xiaoping achieved this massive turnaround through SEZs, through the four modernization pillars, by transforming agriculture, rural economy, leading to large urbanization, massive infrastructure development, port-led and export-led development, he carried out one of the biggest initiatives in 1992 after the end of the Cold War. He carried out the Southern Tour. He visited important industrial clusters like Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, all these massive industrial clusters, SEZs. He went on a tour visiting these places, delivering speeches, inspiring the people and the economy. And according to World Bank and the United Nations, Deng Xiaoping's southern tour directly contributed to further expansion of SEZs, attract more FDI because this gave more confidence to foreign investors. Until then, Western investors were wary of a communist China. Following Deng's southern tour and the opening up that China had carried out and improved relations with the United States, it immediately attracted Western capital, Western technology, and allowing China to essentially power its next stage of growth, which we all got to witness in the early 2000s. China emerged as a leading technology hub, from semiconductor chips to computers, mobile phone, back end of the telecom switching equipment, right? Back end of the telecom and internet industry, power transmission equipment. So you name it, China emerged as the leading producer of every precursor and intermediary and almost every finished good, from textiles to pharmaceuticals. So it is this value creation that happened in China. It is this unique formula that it employed, which allowed China to completely transform and turn around its economic prospects. It leveraged its cheap labor. By 1980s, education had started improving because there was better focus on socio-economic welfare. Healthcare had improved. All the problems associated with poverty were being better tackled under Deng Xiaoping in mid 1980s. With overall improvement in social infrastructure, in public infrastructure, we saw a rapid transformation as agrarian China started shifting towards a manufacturing led China, export oriented China, attracting FDI. More SEZs came up, more ports were set up, advanced infrastructure, cheap electricity, water supply, state led financing, subsidies, incentives, integrating the entire Chinese manufacturing base with global supply chains. This is how China emerged as the most dominant player in global supply chains within a few years. By 1990s, China was almost omnipresent in every single industry, in every single supply chain you can think of. And this dominance and control has further increased in the early 2000s, which continues till date. In the last 2.5 decades, the kind of domination that you see from China is a result of this strong industrial base, manufacturing base that was cultivated as a state policy under Deng Xiaoping. But one of the biggest moments in China's economic transformation came in the year 2001, when China finally opened up its economy to the entire world by joining the World Trade Organization. It became a member of the WTO, which had just recently replaced the GATT. So it essentially accepted the trade mechanisms to create a fair trading world, to limit trade barriers, to create almost equal parity between different competitors and follow the trade rules of the world. So China joining the WTO essentially embedded its manufacturing driven economy into the global supply chain. This allowed other countries to now freely trade with China, right? Depend on China, as China could produce the goods at the massive scale at the cheapest cost. And given that China started diversifying into each and every industry and subsectors, there was simply no other alternative that countries could rely upon. Now, if you take the toys industry, for example, if you take the paint industry, right? Or you take pharmaceuticals, India projects itself as a pharmacy of the world, right? We are the world's largest producer of vaccines and generic drugs. But India's pharma industry will not survive without the precursors and intermediaries coming from China, the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. Almost 60% of APIs used by Indian pharma is imported from China. Look at the global telecom industry, the mobile and internet infrastructure of the world, be it your 2G, 3G, 4G networks. The entire backbone of these networks across the world is built on Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE Telecom. From US to Europe, from India to Africa to Latin America, across the world, the global telecom internet infrastructure, the backend of the telecom infrastructure, which is your switching equipment and the cell phone towers and the gateways, the entire infrastructure comes from Chinese companies such as Huawei and ZTE, giving China a dominating control. You can say the same about power transformers. Across the world, power grids heavily depend on Chinese power transformers. Then you look at emerging industries, critical industries which are now coming up, from quantum computing to semiconductors, right, to robotics, artificial intelligence, clean renewable energy, including electric vehicles, solar and wind power production, production of solar PV cells, photovoltaic cells. China is the clear dominant player across these industries and subsectors. Now, when you look at the data, right, it's quite staggering. Few decades ago, China barely accounted for 3 to 5% of the global share of manufacturing. You know what is that number today? It is about 28%, which means if you, let's say, take 100 goods which are produced in the world, 29 to 30 of those goods are being produced in China. So China's share in global manufacturing was barely 3 to 5% by 1970s. Today, it has grown exponentially, particularly in 1990s, early 2000s, and in the last 10-15 years, where China commands a leadership position. China accounts for close to 29 to even 30% of global manufacturing today. And this accompanies the decline of US, decline of Europe. In many ways, the rise of Asia is largely credited to the rise of China. India also benefited from this. ASEAN countries benefited from this. When the Asian tigers started growing rapidly in 1990s, it was largely because the Chinese economy had a domino effect. China's manufacturing-led growth, export-oriented growth of 1980s had a spillover effect into other Asian countries like South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines. They all drew the benefits of this, right? So when the Asian economic bubble burst during the Asian financial crisis of 1998, China played a pivotal role to stabilize the Asian economy by working with the ASEAN partners. In fact, when China joined the WTO in 2001, believe it or not, it partnered with India. It worked very closely with India on common issues, especially the challenges posed by the global north by developed industrialized countries, which hold most of the patents. India, China were working together at WTO to target US and European companies and ensure that a level playing field was created for the global south nations. That was a remarkable period. Even in the field of climate change, at climate change negotiations, India, China started working together from 1990s and early 2000s, taking a common position to protect the global south and impose the historical responsibilities on the developed world. So all of this created more space for developing nations and for China itself to grow and to build upon its manufacturing base. So today, when you look at what China is doing, right, especially under Xi Jinping is a very, very ambitious leader. He sees Mao Zedong as a personal inspiration. He sees Deng Xiaoping as a great administrator reformer, but he's a very smart leader. Xi Jinping doesn't want to commit the same policy mistakes of Mao Zedong. He wants to have that image of Mao Zedong as an authoritarian leader, as a leader who has consolidated all political power, right? He wants to leave behind a lasting legacy like Mao Zedong, but he wants to avoid Mao's mistakes. He is acutely aware of the disaster caused by the Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution and blind allegiance to communism and socialism. While China remains an authoritarian communist state under Xi Jinping, it has advanced its capitalist model with Chinese characteristics. And China has now blended its economic ambitions with its power ambitions. He wants to adopt the reformist approach of Deng Xiaoping while avoiding the mistakes of Mao Zedong, while trying to build a legacy that is bigger than Deng Xiaoping and even probably Mao Zedong himself. That is what sums up Xi Jinping's approach, right? Xi Jinping, who came up in 2012, has pioneered a new vision where China is exercising greater assertiveness, greater aggression in its geopolitical posture. Now, this Chinese aggression and assertiveness would not have been possible without its economic rise in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s. It's on the back of this tremendous economic rise that China built up its military capabilities, diplomatic capabilities, because they go hand in hand. For a country to be heard, right, for a country to be respected, it's essential that it first builds a strong economic base, which can then power the military and diplomatic rise of the nation. Only those states can command the influence and respect that they deserve. And that is why China today is a dominating power. Under Xi Jinping, it has acquired a new form where Xi Jinping advocates the wolf warrior type of diplomacy. He expects Chinese diplomats, Chinese spies, and military leaders to exhibit the traits of a wolf warrior, which is a very popular movie franchise in China. Right? It's a action movie franchise that is almost like, let's say, India's Durandar, for example. And Xi Jinping advocates that his diplomats, his officials should replicate that kind of behavior, very aggressive, assertive, and that is built on the confidence that comes from having a strong economy, right? The confidence that comes from controlling all key supply chains. China knows very well it can shut down entire economies, it can cripple a nation, bring it down to its knees, if it takes a decision to cut off key supplies. We saw a display of this during COVID-19, right? Not deliberately done, but when China went into a lockdown following the spread of the pandemic, when Chinese industry shut down, supply chains collapsed. From automobile manufacturing in India to chip production somewhere in the US, everything got disrupted across the world. Battery supplies were affected, chip fabrication got affected, right? Uh, Pharmaceuticals industry took a hit. It showed the world basically a trailer, a sample as to what China can actually do if it really puts its intent behind it. So if China decides to punish a country deliberately to exercise geopolitical leverage over them, it can use its economic dominance. And that is the kind of control that China has built today. It has invested heavily in large scale military modernization, building a massive navy. It is building multiple aircraft carriers, nuclear powered submarines. Today, the PLA Navy is almost overshadowing the American Navy and the might of the American armed forces. Chinese intelligence operations have stepped up. Its covert operations, influence operations have gone up. So you see a fusion of economic influence with geopolitical influence being built, where China is effectively controlling the world through its economic dominance. So the fusion of national security with military modernization and rising technological dominance is what really sets China apart. It puts China on the path to become the next big global superpower, which obviously has triggered a new Cold War with the United States. Now, when you look at China exercising its leverage, the Belt and Road Initiative is one classic example, or the One Belt, One Road project. The Belt and Road Initiative is a pet project of Xi Jinping, something that China has pursued since 2012 2013. It's a global network of connectivity projects. It has two main components. It includes the 21st century maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road Economic Belt. So it has a land based component and a maritime component. Under the maritime component, under the Maritime Silk Road Initiative, the 21st century Maritime Silk Road Initiative, China is trying to revive the ancient maritime Silk Route by investing in strategic ports across the world, like Colombo and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, multiple ports in East Africa, from Kenya to Mozambique to Tanzania, multiple port facilities in Indian Ocean, across Southeast and East Asia, across West Asia, Europe as well, and even in Latin America region from Brazil to Ecuador. China has built multiple port facilities, and these ports might serve a dual purpose, a dual use. China says these are just commercial projects, but experts believe this could potentially give China a military advantage. As China controls port operations, it provides massive loans to many small, developing, underdeveloped countries for these projects, eventually pushing them into a debt trap, a debt burden, which is popularly referred to as China's debt trap diplomacy. Like how Sri Lanka's Hambantota port failed commercially, and now a Chinese company has taken over Hambantota for a 99-year lease. And immediately we see the arrival of Chinese spy vessels, which pose a direct threat to India at Hambantota and Colombo. That's not a coincidence. This is China putting its port infrastructure to use under Belt and Road Initiative for a dual purpose. It serves a commercial interest to improve China's trade connectivity, find new export markets, and find the required resources and raw materials. At the same time, it allows China to use these facilities for military purposes if required. Through the Silk Road Economic Belt, China is building a network of road, rail infrastructure, oil, gas pipelines, power plants and power grids, industrial clusters across Central Asia, Russia, West Asia, Eurasia region, opening up to East Europe and further connecting with Central and Western Europe. So China's presence in Africa today is dominant. China's presence in West Asia is also dominant. Same with Central Asia. And the same goes for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So in almost every part of the world, Chinese investments, which have a commercial angle, can easily provide China the diplomatic military influence as well. You see that fusion of technology, economic influence, and military capabilities and diplomatic influence it has built. And that is what really unnerves the United States. As part of this strategy, China today is able to, encircle India in its own backyard, in the Indian Ocean region, in South Asia, by cultivating the so called string of pearls, a series of strategic projects in India's neighborhood, from Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Nepal to Bangladesh to Myanmar to Maldives to East Africa, through which it can encircle India economically and from a strategic point of view. And this is what creates a big concern for India: how to deal with a rising China, which is on its way to become an economic superpower. How to confront Chinese assertiveness and aggression. That remains our biggest diplomatic challenge as of today. But however, China of today is not free from problems, right? China's growth might be spectacular, right? It's well on its way to even overtake the United States very soon and establish complete dominance in every industry and every sector. But China is facing some fundamental problems and deep rooted issues within the country. For example, China's demographic experiment has now turned out to be a big disaster. In 1970s and 80s period, China strictly enforced the one child policy because whatever limited growth China saw in the 50s and 60s because of socialist model, the resources generated, the wealth generated was not enough because of its massive population. So China started seeing the large population as a problem, started curbing population through enforced family planning methods, and strictly implemented the one child policy. Though it helped China to plateau and flatten its population curve, today it's paying a price because today the Chinese population has started aging. Its demographic dividend is almost over. And in the coming years, China will face a serious demographic problem. That's why China has now ended the one child policy and it has actively encouraged a two child, and now it is even encouraging a three child policy by giving incentives to couples to have more kids. In 2017, Xi Jinping liberalized this population control policy to promote the two child plan. And in 2021, after the pandemic, China has further relaxed the control over demographic control, encouraging young couples to have three children or more. But even this will not help China avoid the demographic trap. The next 30, 40 years will be difficult for China because of its aging population. As the burden of taking care of the old goes up, its manufacturing and production could take a hit because of the limited availability of labor that China will experience in the next few years and decades. So, this is a very difficult problem for which you don't have immediate solutions. And for China, this will remain a consistent problem for the next 30, 40 years and even beyond that. The other challenges, they are deep rooted within its economic sectors. Now take real estate for example. China's real estate exploded in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. Huge apartments, massive cities, clusters came up everywhere. And today, half of the buildings are lying empty. People who bought the houses have not been able to repay the loans that they had borrowed. So China's real estate bubble has now exploded, with even the biggest real estate firms going bankrupt, right? You might have heard of Evergrande, one of China's biggest real estate firms, which has completely tanked and collapsed. If you look at China's big giants like Alibaba, for example, right? How China has purged even billionaires like Jack Ma, how it has exercised state control over Huawei, ZTE, and leveraged the private companies for its national security objectives. That is another matter of deep concern. Today, you have Chinese AI companies like DeepSeek, for example, right? It's widely believed that Chinese security establishment, they force the private companies, the technology companies to create security backdoors through which Chinese intelligence can hack into networks across the world. And that's why most countries are wary of allowing Chinese companies to play a role in their critical infrastructure. So the lack of trust that the world has on Chinese companies and technology is another big challenge which China cannot overcome easily. That's why when you look at the current 5G networks which are coming up and the upcoming 6G networks, most countries are trying to move away from their China dependency. US, Europe, India, they've all boycotted Chinese companies officially or unofficially. Then look at the weak domestic demand within Chinese economy. There is a clear deflationary trend. Deflationary pressure is rising because see, decades of manufacturing capabilities that were built has now created excess capacity, much beyond what was required for local economy and the global economy. So today, Chinese industries have excess capacity. That's why China is so desperate to find new markets and continue boosting exports because the domestic demand has saturated. And the falling demographic numbers, aging population adds to the weakening demand and creates to it basically creates this vicious cycle of a deflationary cycle where every industry will face weaker demand, creating and leaving behind excess capacity which is underutilized. This will result in mass layoffs, huge rise in unemployment, and this can have a cascading effect. And that is what China is currently dealing with. Plus, it has external problems emerging from United States. Donald Trump's US has identified China as the enemy number one, and the tariff wars, the technological wars between them, and the geopolitical games and the covert military exchanges that they are having, right? This is opening up a completely new dimension. Trump's tariffs were primarily aimed at hurting China's manufacturing base. In fact, Western companies were encouraged to follow the China plus one investment approach after COVID 19 to diversify investments and to shift manufacturing to other countries. So, countries like India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, they all benefited from China plus one strategy, where many big global giants shifted manufacturing and started investing in other countries, creating more opportunities for countries like India. But Trump's attempt to dismantle the Chinese economy, to try and, you know, levy higher tariffs on Chinese exports to the US, this strategy of Trump also has very quickly backfired because China has managed to use its economic leverage to hurt Donald Trump politically and economically. Though China faces a big challenge here, it has managed to essentially get back at Donald Trump. Right? When Donald Trump traveled to China, they basically reached an understanding where Trump has now started easing the tariffs and they've come to an understanding that such reciprocal tit for tat action is not productive anymore because China hit back at Trump's primary vote bank, the agrarian American economy. China stopped soybean import from the US, corn import from the US. China is one of the biggest consumers, and US is a big exporter. So when American farmers are hit, American rural agrarian economy is hit, that directly affects the primary vote base of Donald Trump, the conservative vote base in rural America. So eventually, it forced US to take a back step. China even restricted access to critical technologies like rare earth magnets, whereas US is restricting access to GPUs and other advanced semiconductors and chip manufacturing technologies. For example, lithography machines. They are with just one Dutch company called ASML, right, which has a global monopoly, and China is trying to replicate it, which will take many more years. But US is working with European partners to limit key technologies from falling into the hands of China. China is known to carry out cyber espionage, corporate espionage. It tries to steal trade secrets and patents, right, and technological innovation from American companies, American universities. So this remains an ongoing conflict and a secret war between them, a technological war, a economic competition, and the continuing tariff action, the tit for tat wars against each other. Plus the American provocation with US backing Taiwan, with US trying to intervene in South China Sea issue, trying to contain China in the region, and China's assertiveness, where China is now extending its military and intelligence presence in America's backyard, in South America, Central America, Mexico, and that is something the US is alarmed, worried about. So this has serious challenges for India as well, right? This year there was an essay topic that when two elephants fight, it's the grass which suffers. So as the US China Cold War intensifies, that their trade and economic conflict also intensifies, other nations and the global economy could take a bigger hit. But I think this experience of China's rise, this lesson offers key lessons for countries like India, right? India, more or less, has a similar trajectory as that of China, right? Both were struggling countries, massive poverty levels. They both became rising Asian giants. And today, India is it's trapped in a middle income loop, right? We are stuck in the middle income trap. We are not able to get out of the middle income trap and push towards faster manufacturing led growth. In case of India, we've almost skipped manufacturing growth, and from agriculture, we have jumped towards services, exposing our weakness in manufacturing. I think that is where we can draw lessons from China. How China pioneered its manufacturing led growth. And it ensured a careful transition, a controlled transition from agrarian economy to manufacturing, export led economy to service led economy. And India has missed that entire trajectory. But even now, we can course correct, we can still build our own self reliance in key industries for key resources, raw materials, and supply chain resilience. And that is where I think India should learn these lessons. So, for you as aspirants, China's remarkable transformation offers key lessons. Don't blindly look at China as an enemy, as a hostile neighbor. China has some key lessons to offer for India. There is a history of India China partnership. Don't be driven by the prime time debates, right? Where people are blindly shouting that China is just an enemy state. But there is a history of India China actually collaborating and working together in the past. So there are opportunities where we can learn, we can work together. Tomorrow, China will require a labor force, and India could potentially provide that cheap labor. So there are opportunities that we should be open and willing to explore. China could potentially become a reliable supplier of key materials and technology if India could provide the cheap labor. And that is a great trade off that both sides can consider. So there are opportunities. There is enough space in this world for both India and China to rise, grow, and coexist peacefully without getting into conflict. Right? This was a famous quote by then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh that India and China need not be natural rivals and enemies. Yes, for two neighbors who are rising fast, who have standing issues, it's natural to have hostility, but it need not turn into a difficult relationship, right? The world is so large, the world has so many opportunities. It can accommodate the rise of both India and China simultaneously. And if both can work together, nothing like it. It can transform the world, probably end Western domination, right? And probably by the middle of the century, you might even see the dominance of Asian countries led by India and China. For that to happen, India China collaboration and partnership is equally important, right? So, on this note, I bring this session to an end. Let me know what is the most inspiring development that you see with China's transformation. What lesson can we draw, can we implement with regard to our own domestic economic challenges? Please let me know in the comments. So, that is it for today. I'll see you tomorrow in the next class. Till then, take care. Have a good night.